All right, we have half the class here, which is awesome. Welcome back to another episode of Comparative Military, where we will continue our discussion of Gandhi. I do have a bureaucratic announcement, or a couple of them to make. I just want to wait for a few more minutes to have people roll in if they are planning to use them. 23 people, excellent. What's going on in the world? How are you guys doing? How's life? Anything happening in the world?
The semester's ending, and my anxiety is I haven't really been paying attention to the world generally.
Semester's ending, the world's ending.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, from your perspective. Okay, that's cool. Anything else besides the world ending, Salma?
I saw an article today. In Tel Aviv, there's a group of Mizrahi Jews being displaced to build room for luxury apartments, and I just think it's ironic
Sure.
because they displaced Palestinians.
Sure. Okay. Kirsten?
The Belarusian president, he's not really the president because he kind of like,
Dictator.
yeah. He created a migrant crisis at the Polish border. Like he created one, he like brought people over to show that like EU nations aren't above the whole like treatment of people sort of thing.
Right. Is he doing it or is Putin doing it?
He's doing it.
He's
Oh, well, yeah, that's true. Could be.
As I've heard, last I heard, the Russian army was massing on the Ukrainian border. An invasion seemed imminent as well. Andrew?
There's this like far-right intellectual, Eric Zemmour in France, who's about to enter the presidential race, and he got this big profile in the New Republic that was really interesting. Honestly, not that dissimilar from Huntington, just kind of in the French context of, secularism and republicanism. It was really interesting.
I think one of the interesting things in the last election was, I think, what's his name?
Ron?
Macron's prime minister or whatever, basically out Le Pen in a debate. And
I
she
remember.
was like, what are you saying? This is my
I remember what you're talking about. That was funny.
It was pretty funny
Yeah.
when that happened. Mercedes?
For the Belarus thing, one of the presidential candidates, she's the wife of someone who's like arrested by the president. They're coming to she's coming to USF for like a speech thing, and there's like a thing where you can post video questions
Oh, yeah.
for the speech
Yeah.
thing. Yeah, so we got a little presentation in one of my classes because it's extra credit for like the questions.
All
She
right.
gave the presentations so people like know what it is.
Sure. This is in Tatiana's class? Empirical politics? Okay. Right. That makes sense. No extra credit in this class, unfortunately. Anything else happening in the world? Okay, all right. Well, let's get started. We have 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 27 people. Unheard of. Unheard of, I said. All right, so welcome back to another episode of Comparative Political Theory with me, your host, Mano. I just have a couple of bureaucratic announcements that I want to make. First of which is, I hope everybody got the reading for coming Monday. The Gandhi reading, I uploaded it to files.
I thought that's what we were reading today.
We are, but also we'll be continuing our discussion of it into Monday as well. So, everybody got that? Yes, the constructive program, all right. Hopefully we'll get to it today. We'll see how the conversation goes. So, that's the first announcement. Second announcement, as I mentioned to you last time, I was thinking about it, now I think it's pretty certain. But it's not certain until I send a message about it on Canvas, but more or less this is certain. I think next Wednesday we will not have class. I don't want to be sitting here waiting for people to show up. Lots of people, I'm sure, have good intentions of showing up, but it'll just be a mess if people don't show up. And I'm standing here. Poor Shomik is driven from wherever he's driving to come here, and we're standing here with two people, and I can't have a class with two people. That would just be bizarre. So next Wednesday, this coming Wednesday, we're not going to have class, but I will upload the readings for the week after Thanksgiving. It's a very short reading, as I mentioned to you before, and I think it'll make for a very, fruitful discussion should people choose to take it on. Now for the other, yes?
For the short little reading, are we gonna be able to do a journal on that? Or?
Sure, if we want to, yeah. We'll make it available, right? Shall we?
Say that again?
We can make a journal reading, a journal assignment.
Oh, yeah,
available
no
for that.
problem, no problem.
So, but I would try and, yes, Mario.
There's gonna be another journal.
Have you done two journals prior to? Okay, so yeah, there'll be one, there'll be another one, yes.
We'll set up an assignment for the.
So this one for today won't be the last one, there's gonna be another one.
Well, there was gonna be one for Monday anyway.
Oh,
What's
And there's gonna be one for Monday after that.
And you?
the one for
Good.
me is on the reading.
Yes.
How'd you do on the last assessment?
Yeah.
I got like an A minus, you?
Got 28.
Oh,
Any other questions? Okay, so now the big bureaucratic announcement that I want to make otherwise is, I make it with some degree of enthusiasm every year when I do it, but in this particular instance, it's particularly bizarre for me, given that I'm talking to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 people who are here sometimes, who are not here at other times, and 22 people online, many of whom I've never even seen before. So this is a very peculiar situation. But I'm sure all of you got, or will be getting soon, an email asking you to evaluate the course. All the courses that you are taking in, you'll be asked to evaluate the course. This is a standard procedure that every university takes on at the end of the semester in order to gain a sense of what courses to offer next year, what the enrollment was like, what sort of responsibility we're getting, in some cases, whom to hire, whom to rehire, what sort of interest there is in the course material, etc. And all of that is, of course, very, very valuable. But beyond that, from the perspective of an instructor, this is the one chance we get where, in more or less, although imperfect conditions, we get a sense of what worked in the classroom and what didn't work for you in the classroom. And you're able to say it with the protection of anonymity, and of course the grades are already in, so not only do I not know who you are and what you're writing, but even if I did, I cannot retaliate against you because you're protected by the fact that I'll only see them well after your final grades are posted. So it's a very valuable exercise. There are lots of ways in which we know that this exercise doesn't work particularly well. Women are, traditionally get poorer evaluations than men do. People of color tend to get worse evaluations than white people do. This is sort of, statistically speaking, there is plenty of evidence for all the ways in which this process does not work, and yet this is the closest thing, at least we have in our university, for understanding what worked and did not work in a class. From my perspective, I really look forward to the conference. And I can tell you that when I first started teaching as a grad student at UF, I was scared and excited about what my students would say after my very first class that I taught. And by and large, the evaluations that I got that first time around were fairly good, except for this one person who, the evaluation system, I think was kind of like here, was from 1 to 5, 1 being the lowest and 5 being the highest. This one person gave me 1s all the way through, on every metric, just the lowest grade possible. And you're starting out as a teacher, and it's just, everybody else gives you good grades, but you just think about the one person who gave you bad grades. And it really stuck with me. And I was like, all right, let's see what happened. Let me find out what happened. So I opened up this person's comments to see why this person gave me all 1s. And this person had written nothing. So from my perspective, the story I tell myself is that person meant to say I'm number 1 across all categories. And they thought that this fact spoke for themselves. They just misunderstood what the scale system was. The point is, what I would like for you to do, or everybody online and in person, is to fill out these evaluations. But please take some time to leave some comments. Help me understand your reasoning. Help me understand what worked, what did not work. This was a bizarre semester for me. I've never taught a course predominantly it seemed from the numbers that are online and with very few people in class. Because my teaching method depends on generating energy in the classroom. I throw energy at you. And when there's a classroom full of people, and typically in my classrooms, people aren't allowed to use any computers at all, no devices. When I throw my energy out, it just typically happens that somebody picks up the energy here and it transmits through the classroom. Over here, there are vast gaps, empty seats just crying out at me. And I don't know how to incorporate that emptiness into the class discussions, knowing that there are, as of right now, for example, 23 people online who often don't say anything. Sometimes people just log on and go away and do something else. So it creates for a very weird environment. So I'd like to know what worked and what didn't work, how things were for you, the readings, etc. Just whatever you feel you can do, I would welcome it. But please do take the time to fill it out. Please do try and fill in the comments, and in the process, you'll be able to add to the experience of people after you who take a course such as this. Any questions about that? Yes, please.
Is this course going to be offered again next semester?
Not next semester, but whenever it's offered next. What, is that?
I was just wondering.
No, it's not. No, I'm offering another course next semester, but this one, I don't know, depending on when I teach it next. I'm not sure. Maybe fall, in the fall again. Andrew?
I'm taking your contemporary political theory class next semester, so are we like going away from devices and stuff like that?
I'm gonna have to see what the case numbers are like in the spring. If it's still bad and, you know, whatever, then we'll be the same as we were here. But if it's not, then I would like to have people back in the classroom. This has been a very, very bizarre experience. It's also dispiriting. I walk away from our classes often feeling like glum. I'm like, I threw all this energy out there and I could get nothing back. And it's not your fault. It's not the fault of the people online. It's just the way that this class has been divided between people who are not even here, who've never met, I've never met, and people who come to class. They have their reasons for not coming. You have your reasons for coming. Just doesn't work out particularly well. I will tell you one final thing about the evaluation thing. That window closes sooner than you expect. I always think to myself, I have more time to tell my students to fill out the evaluation. Students think they have more time, and then the window closes, and then they're not able to fill it out. So I would do it sooner rather than later. Keep in mind, of course, there have been good days and there have been bad days, and try and average them out as best you see it. Any other questions? Yes.
I have a question relating to the journals. Is it just 4 total the whole semester, or
There were 6.
6? Okay.
Yeah, 2 in the beginning, but I was quite late on talking about that, if you remember, so we had to make do for it in a different way, and then the 4 for the rest of it.
Okay.
So,
It's in the syllabus 4. That's why I was just wondering.
we talked about this last time, but we had to change things around a little bit.
Okay. Just want to know.
Any other questions? Okay, all right. With that, let's get into talking about Gandhi. So I mentioned an example to you last time, and I think it was a very profound experience, and it happened right at the end of the class, which is good because I think we left in this place where, you know, we were. So I hope some of us were enthusiastic about what Gandhi represents, what the challenge was, but it also means that we have to try and recreate that mind space. You have to go back into the mind space where we left off last time. We can't just pick it up, as it were. So I'm going to try and be provocative. I'm going to try to be provocative in a way that Gandhi himself was provocative, and have us talk through online and in person what would be involved in a situation like this. So Gandhi claims that civilization, true civilization, is the path of duty, not of rights. Civilization, understood on Western lines, is a civilization that is oriented around bodily welfare. My on-cloud shoes as opposed to the Chuck Taylors I used to wear. That, Gandhi says, is not civilization. Civilization is moral duty. Focusing on that shows you what you should do as opposed to other things. And if that's the case, Gandhi says, the instruments of satyagraha, of civil disobedience, are powerful enough to be applicable in all circumstances everywhere. In fact, he says, we know that soul force has been the dominant mechanism for bringing justice historically. And we know this, he says, because the vast majority of the vast expanses of human history, while they do not necessarily record this, exist because of the goodness that soul force requires. And he says, at one point, he says, look, he says to the reader, I can find the page together if you want to. He says, look, you think that there is no evidence of soul force working in history. I say to you, it has been nothing but soul force that has worked through history. Because when you think, you, the reader, or the average person, think about history, you think about battles, you think about wars and revolutions, these transformative linchpins that indelibly mark themselves in human memory. But between those events, between these transformative cataclysmic events that we all remember, are the vast expanses of human history where institutions existed, religions existed, families existed. And these things existed because of the exercise of soul force. Soul force doesn't leave a mark in the same way as wars do, but doesn't mean it's no less effective. Now that is a very bold claim on Gandhi's part. And so let's provocatively think through it. What is the claim? What are the implications of it? Where does it work and where does it not work? And let's start with, I guess, I don't know why I wrote genocide as a separate thing, the Holocaust was a genocide. Let's look at the Holocaust. Would Gandhian passive resistance have worked in the case of the Holocaust? I can tell you, I think I mentioned this to you before, Gandhi himself thought, yeah, it could. He thought that that's what Jewish people in Europe ought to practice. They ought to practice civil disobedience. Caesar, is that a hand? Wait, hold on.
Yes, sir.
Hold on. If you're talking, Caesar, I can't hear you. Hold on. Sorry, go, wait. All right, go.
Okay. I don't think that Gandhi's version of obedience could have worked against the Holocaust or genocide in general, just because of how extreme those actions actually are. I remember reading in one of my other classes that Gandhi actually wrote a letter to Hitler saying, please stop the violence of war earlier before World War II, and that went to deaf ears. I was going to say blind ears. And basically, I don't think that the nonviolent stance that Gandhi was thinking could have stopped Jews from actually going to prevent the Holocaust and actions like that.
Okay, so Caesar says it could not have worked. In fact, Gandhi asked Hitler to stop and Hitler did nothing. So there you go, there's the proof. Mercedes.
I think that it could have changed the reception or like the moral responsibility that people felt in the Holocaust, but I ultimately don't think that it would have prevented it. Just because the intent between the British rulers and like the Nazi Party were completely different. Like the Nazi Party, they attempted to destroy Judaism in total, like globally. And for the British, it wasn't to destroy people, it was to use them as a means to an end. So I think that it would have changed people's moral responsibility in the matter, but I don't think it ultimately would have changed the overarching outcome.
Okay, you're absolutely right, Mercedes, and I'm not disagreeing with you, I just want to clarify now for the rest of, based on what you said. I don't think the question can be if Jews had practiced nonviolence as Gandhi describes it, no Jews would have been killed. Like, I don't think Gandhi would make that claim. But the Holocaust, in its extent, in its depravity, would have occurred. That's what Gandhi is saying. If Jewish people had been able to practice civil disobedience. So, okay, but I take your point. The Nazi Party was a party that was devoted to destroying, the Jewish people, wiping them off the face of the earth. And so you cannot reason with them in the way that you could reason, Gandhi would reason with the British, for example, is your point. Andrew?
To kind of go off Mercedes' point is I feel like that Gandhi is kind of applying his own framework from India, maybe a broader colonial perspective, to a situation where that doesn't apply because like in the text we're supposed to read today, he talks about, I don't know how exactly pronounce it, khadi, like, making your own fabric and all this stuff and divesting yourself from the kind of British economy and saying, we're going to produce our own cloth, our own food, all this stuff and stuff like that. And that's, I feel, works in the context of the British Raj because then it's like, it was dependent on Indians to drive its economy, whereas in Germany, it wasn't reliant on Jewish people. I mean, in some ways, it relied on forced labor in concentration camps to maybe drive certain sectors, but
The funny thing about that is that from what we know, the horrific thing about that is that the Germans knew that the concentration camp was actually unproductive economically for the war effort. But such was their hatred that they actually nevertheless
yeah.
poured resources into an economically and militarily, sort of counterproductive thing.
So, has anyone here read Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning book? So, in there, he talks about how it's his own experience in the camps as an eyewitness account. He talks about like the people who were most good, the people who gave bread to other people and were most self-sacrificing and more morally upright didn't make it. And we keep talking about like would passive resistance or Gandhi's sort of philosophy work. We're saying like could it work? It was tried and it didn't work. I mean that's the point I'm trying to make. Like there were some times where you could, in a certain sense, appeal to the British public's sense of consciousness when, Great Britain is 6, 7, 8 time zones away, and it's actually kind of inefficient to rule a whole continent when you're an island nation. It's very easy for the Nazis to go after Jews when they're 6, 7, 8 million people.
Sure.
It's pretty efficient. When someone's like, you can't negotiate with evil in the way you can negotiate with the good, and yeah, I think everyone should. I think that book should be required reading for every human being on the planet. But I'm the minority.
Anybody else?
So I think Gandhi's philosophy, it's very defensive and not very offensive. So like with the Holocaust, I don't think, I agree with what everyone else is saying. Like, I don't think it would have changed anything. I think it still would have happened because Gandhi's philosophy is very focused on like interchange. So it would be whoever's like the victim, they would have to make that change within themselves to sort of be able to like handle it. And it's more about like someone being able to, like if you're the victim, then like being able to handle whatever like violence that's happening. I feel like that's more of his philosophy than like being aggressive and being like going to the oppressor and being like, hey, like this isn't what you should be doing.
Right. So there was I hear what you're saying. So you also think that no, it wouldn't have worked.
Yeah.
Okay, fine. Does anybody want to make an argument for why it may have worked?
Why it may have worked.
Why it may have worked? Or what kind of work it would have done, if not perfectly worked? Sorry.
I would say, well, because of the nature of the event, you know what I mean, which is a little bit different, which we kind of talked about. It was much more like a personal vendetta that wasn't really built on kind of political rationality or economical rationality, so that's a little bit different. I would say maybe a little bit what Matthew was saying, that what would have happened was I feel like there were people who did passive resistance. We know of famous people, a lot of notable authors who came out. Resistance was the only thing you could do. I think if you kind of direct resistance, the outcome that I can foresee and what did actually happen was you'd be met with your demise and a very violent end. So I think that, yeah, I don't think that they would be able to use any kind of direct force without being quickly put down.
Everybody?
Yep.
Cool. See?
I think that if it was a movement that would have been able to have been mobilized in the time before Jewish people were sequestered away from the rest of German society, I think that in that moment in time, if a piece of a nonviolent protest or some sort of movement was able to come, I think that it could have really changed the hearts and minds of the German public, because I feel like a lot of what happened is really easy to write off when you simply don't know the details, or perhaps where you don't have an opposing narrative. Because when you're like, there's an overwhelming amount of Nazi propaganda, so it's very easy to say that perhaps I don't completely agree with it, but there's no other story that I could believe in. So I think that if it was a movement that had happened, there would have been more people that would have paid attention to it or at least been aware of it,
Right.
which I
So-
feel like could have made a difference.
Right. So, so go on. I've uploaded a letter from the philosopher Martin Buber to Gandhi, where he basically, he was a Jewish philosopher who was a fan of Gandhi, but after reading Gandhi's sort of advice to the Jewish people that they should practice satyagraha against the Nazis, he basically launches a direct assault on Gandhi, and I've uploaded the text of that to Canvas if you can look at it when you are so inclined. But I take your point, Mercedes, because you're pointing in a direction that is interesting. Let me just, sorry, I don't want you to know my location. One of the things, so there are ways in which Gandhi is asking us to be attentive to the intricacies of human psychology that the subsequent reconstruction of the Nazis, and maybe the attempts of the Nazis themselves, kind of makes us insensitive to. So what the Nazis wanted to do was to show themselves to be unemotionally tough people who make the hard choices that nobody else wants to make. They wanted to show themselves as that. And to a certain extent, if somebody rolls in jackbooted, with a dressed in, what are they dressed in? There's actually a Hugo Boss. Yes. Literally Hugo Boss. They wore Hugo Boss. A Hugo Boss sort of suit, and basically commanded you to do something, they would exert a certain kind of authority. And certainly it was an authority that, even when there wasn't a barrel of a gun next to it, managed to sway lots of people until the Nazis reached Denmark.
Be vindicated
You guys know
in
the
this
story of the Nazis
conversation
in Denmark?
between him and Tom Brady. Because if he's winning.
We've come to liberate you from the Jewish people. We want you to identify all Jewish people and have them wear the yellow star. What did the Danish people do?
They refused to help implement the final solution.
In fact, they went one step further. The Danish king said that I will wear a yellow star. I will resist the Nazis. And against the force of the people refusing to cooperate with the Nazis, the Nazi toughness just evaporated. So resistance to the Nazis, number one, was possible. It was not always implemented. There were other structural factors in all these countries that they invaded, deep-seated anti-Semitism within them. In fact, the story goes that the Romanians were so enthusiastically anti-Semitic that they started sending Jewish people in numbers that the Nazis couldn't even absorb into their concentration camps. And they told, hey guys, slow down, you're being way too anti-Semitic, just slow down there. Right? So there were structural factors that sort of allow things to happen. So I'm not diminishing that, obviously. But I want to get at the claim itself. What is being offered in the claim that Gandhi is making for passive resistance or civil disobedience or soul force, as he calls it? In Denmark, it worked. The other thing that the Nazis did, and they were intent upon this, and so the philosopher Hannah Arendt talks about this to some degree, they insisted upon pushing into what she calls holes of oblivion, instances of people actually actively resisting the Nazis. So, are you guys familiar with the, let me make sure I can get this right. Yad Vashem? Anybody?
Is he Ukrainian? Okay.
It's a memorial for the Holocaust in Israel. And there they have a category called the Friends of the Jewish People category. where historically lots of people who have saved Jews and rescued Jews are sort of, commemorated in that. And in that list of names are people like Oskar Schindler in the list. And so this guy named Anton Schmidt. Now let me take you to a different point in history. In 1962, 61, 62, the Nazi who was one of the architects of the final solution, Adolf Eichmann, has escaped Germany and has found refuge in Argentina, where it's more or less open, it's an open secret that he's living there. Lots of Nazis escaped to Argentina. And there's in fact, anyone seen X-Men First Class?
No, but I know, I have friends who.
There's an actual scene of Magneto visiting some of these Nazis. Anyway, so in 1961, I think 62, the Mossad goes into Argentina, kidnaps Adolf Eichmann, the highest ranking Nazi that they've been able to find, and they bring him back to Jerusalem to be tried. So by the way, as far as X-Men First Class is concerned, Julian says it's the best scene in the movie. It's pretty intense. Anyway, so they bring Adolf Eichmann to Jerusalem to be tried for crimes against the Jewish people. And this is, front page news. Something that Western powers don't want to talk about because a lot of former Nazis have become members of the West German government. Lots of former Nazis have come to the US and have joined NASA and things like that. People don't want to talk about the Holocaust. They want to push it under the rug. Now, Israel is going to try this Nazi. And so the person I mentioned before, Hannah Arendt, she writes this book called
Eichmann in Jerusalem.
Jerusalem, thank you. Eichmann in Jerusalem. A report on the banality of evil. It's actually very interesting because lots of Israelis go to this trial expecting Adolf Eichmann to be this very, a Hollywood Nazi. I mean, has anyone seen, I think I may have mentioned it before. Let me see if I can find a good, let's see. What is it called? Quentin Tarantino film?
Glorious Bastards.
Glorious Bastards. I don't want best scenes. I want strudel scene. Oh no, it is. Yeah, strudel.
Hans.
Awesome. Kirtana, could you do us the honor? Anyone seen the, anyone not seen the movie? Should watch the movie. For those who have seen the movie, that was, should be absolutely terrifying in the context of where we are at this point. Right? Because he knows who she is. She knows at some level that he knows who she is. She is Jewish. She's run away from him before. He's killed her entire family. And this is the way in which the whole scene is presented is amazing. Just the decadence of that strudel and the cream on top of it and the cigarette that's put out. It's just magnificent, a magnificent scene. But it does too much. It does too much because it creates the illusion, which sometimes was true, sometimes was not, that the Nazi will was implacable. Its knowledge total, its power everywhere. But that was an illusion that the Nazis themselves wanted to project. And what they wanted to hide above all else were instances where this system broke down. And it broke down frequently. There were people who could not, soldiers who were asked to shoot, a line of the prisoners lined up in front of a ditch, who refused to do so. Yes.
I was just gonna go off since you were talking about earlier about Eichmann in Jerusalem, which I think they talked about that Denmark thing in the book. I don't remember. But like she gives an example of Eichmann going to some meeting where a bunch of these like mid-level bureaucrats and members of like civil society all kind of sign off on the final solution. And she mentions that to someone like Eichmann, who in the book is kind of portrayed as being like someone who thinks he's smarter than he is, someone who just kind of goes along with the flow and just kind of accepts that he's following the law, seeing all these kind of like respectable people just kind of go along with essentially horrific genocide. He just kind of like, okay, that makes it way easier for me to accept. So in your context of like trying to cover up people disagreeing with it, it's kind of the inverse of that, of having people who are respectable agree to it, then it makes it easier for people to go along.
But the respectable people who did not always agree with it, they were forgotten. They were tried, they were killed, and they were sort of pushed to the side. And one of the things about the Yad Vashem in Israel is to remember those people. And so Arendt says in this trial, when this is happening in Jerusalem, the prosecution brings all of the witnesses to testify against Eichmann. The problem is, of course, that the trial is modeled on a criminal trial, kind of, where Eichmann himself never killed anybody. He simply made sure that the trains ran on time and were full, so it's horrific euphemism, full of people going into Auschwitz or all the other concentration camps. He didn't actually kill anybody. So all these people come and they sort of talk about their experience of what happened to them or happened to their family members, more likely, during the Holocaust. And then somebody mentions the name of Anton Schmidt and how he was an Austrian who was in the German army who not only refused to go along with this, but actively supplied papers to Jewish people to escape, and for which he was caught and was executed by the Germans. And Arendt, this is a beautiful moment in this book, and I invite you to read it. Andrew's read it, and I'll read it. Beautiful moment, she says, in this atmosphere of pain and suffering and just overwhelming emotions, it was as though with the name of Anton Schmidt, the skies opened up and a light shone through. And people realized how much better things would have been if there had been only a few more Anton Schmidts. Or if the Nazi attempt to push the Anton Schmidts into holes of oblivion had not succeeded. How different the experience would have been. Did that happen? Is that a question?
No.
Right. So I went down this whole route to make the case that our subsequent interpretation of what the Holocaust was and who the Nazis were does too much in terms of evacuating from the actual historical experience instances of people who resisted. And in so doing, we create this behemoth that we think is total and absolute and needs nothing but a total and absolute response, when in fact perhaps other avenues are available. Now Gandhi, for his part, I think he withdrew his suggestions, because I don't think he knew that he didn't know as much about the situation as Martin Buber, whose letter to him, as I said, I've uploaded on Canvas. But Gandhi did believe he did believe this, that the act of Jewish people willingly, actively surrendering themselves to what the Nazis wanted or claimed they wanted would have a transformative effect on Germans themselves. He believed that because he believed that regardless of the laws within which one is operating, human character is somewhat consistent. And the Nazis at some level knew this. Right? So they took great pains sometimes to hide what was happening. So a lot of Germans could claim, I mean, perhaps unreasonably, but men claim more than they should have, could claim they didn't know what was going on. Well, Gandhi's part, I think he's wrong. I don't think he's wrong. For Gandhi's part, if the argument was that no Jewish people would have been killed, the Holocaust would have ended like that, or whatever, the Nazis would have become just a mildly anti-Semitic regime as opposed to the monomaniacal craziness that they were. And that was the claim that Gandhi was making, and then Gandhi would have been wrong. There's no way that would have worked. But the question remains, would as many people have died? Would a stopping point have potentially come earlier? Kirtan?
Would Gandhi say, like, is running away from the situation, or would he want them to actually, like, give up their lives?
Give up their lives.
So he wouldn't say, like, escaping would, like, not Satyagraha.
Escaping is also there. Though, of course, I think there's an element of visibility. I think he doesn't want people to be stupid, right? And just like walk into, a hail of bullets just for the sake of it. There's a certain theater involved. You have to have people looking, you have to have an audience, there's a certain publicity needed, which you have to create. You have to create these circumstances. As we saw with the video last time of the civil rights movement folks being trained, they were training for these events, these moments that would happen. They would make them happen. They would create flashpoints that would draw people's attention and would use that as a mechanism to contest what was happening to them. Well, the funny thing, I don't know why, I need to find a better transition sentence. So even someone like Hannah Arendt. So Hannah Arendt is Jewish. She escapes to the US and she gets reports, that something like the Holocaust is happening, and her husband says, that's impossible. The Germans would never do that. It's a waste of resources. It's a waste of, whatever. They would never do it. They would never do that. Most people did not know what was happening. And so maybe it would have worked, maybe it would not have. I don't know. Matt, sorry, go ahead.
We always talk about what we would do in certain situations, like public displays of compliance. But does anyone know the name of the guy who didn't Hitler salute in that photo that's really famous? And do you know what happened to him? His name was August Landsmesser. And he died, I think, in 1944 in Croatia. And the reason he didn't salute is because he had children with a Jewish woman, and both of his daughters were half Jewish.
Yeah.
And, there were people who hid Jews, like straight up in Berlin, and didn't say anything about it, but weren't going to have public displays of protest because the cost to them would have been, I'm going to die a really fucked up death. And that's and people always like to say I would have protested, I would have done this, I would have done that. The movie Valkyrie, which is about the secret German to murder Hitler. People tried to murder him, and they got shot.
That dude, the whole Tom Cruise thing was just like a thing.
I know, it was kind of ridiculous.
It was not, but here's I'll give you another example. There were people who were married to Jewish spouses, have Jewish spouses, were told, hey, divorce your spouse. the unwillingness to think, right? So someone like Eichmann, when he thought for himself, if he ever did, his thinking was act in such a way that if the Führer, if he knew about it, would approve. That was his understanding of thinking. That's as far as his thinking would go. He could only place himself in the mindset of a superior officer or the officer above him. And I think in that sense, the absence of thinking through, the substitution of reason, rational calculation with thinking more capaciously, taking the perspective of somebody else, that was the basis for the banality of evil. So, but in that sense, it's important, right? We think of evil as radical, as ruthless, as beyond any depth that, will devour us if we don't resist it with the cataclysmic forces of good against evil. But history is not that simple, Mercedes.
Could we make these arguments to be applied to genocide in general or just specifically to the Holocaust?
Well, so the Holocaust is an example of genocide. So here's what I was trying to get us into that mind space. So let me bring you back to the mind space, right? Where we left off last time. So 1947, in India gets its independence. And what is India is now cleaved into two parts, a Muslim majority part and a Hindu majority part. And people from the Muslim majority parts are rushing to get across the border to the Hindu majority parts. People from the Hindu majority parts who are Muslim are rushing, for the most part, to get to the Muslim majority parts. But it unleashes, this moment of political breakdown unleashes cataclysmic violence. There are riots in the street, people are getting killed, people are getting butchered, massacred. I told you last time, the train leaves Delhi, let's say, and arrives in Lahore. By the time it arrives there, everybody's been killed. Everybody, all the passengers on the train are killed. Women have been raped, children's heads bashed in, the most horrific, grotesque violence. Similarly, trains leaving from Lahore, arriving in Delhi, or whatever. Same thing has happened, right? And once this thing unleashes itself, it's very hard to let go of it. I have an uncle who is, well, he's not an uncle, he's a granduncle. He's my dad's uncle. He was, I guess now he's in his 80s, and he must have been about 9 years old or something when this happened. And he said he remembers standing on top of a train that had stopped. And looking out into the field, he sees a man on his knees with his arms behind him, and a guy with a sword chops his head off. That stays with you. I can put it in words, but that thing stays with you. And that guy, that granduncle, his politics is still attached to that moment. He still thinks about revenge from the context of that. That thing stays with you on both sides. The problem is no side, everybody remembers its own wounds. Nobody remembers the wounds they inflicted on the other side. And so this hatred on one side mirrors hatred on the other. It's different from the Holocaust. There was no hatred there. But in this particular instance, there was. So anyway, the riots are happening in 47. And in the city of Calcutta, the riots are particularly bad. And so Gandhi goes there. Gandhi goes to Calcutta to try and quell the riots. And he says, I take it upon myself. This is my fault. I did not lead the process in the way that it should have been led. And as penance, it's a very weird way of thinking about it, but nevertheless, as penance, I'm going to go on a fast. I will fast until the violence stops. I would sooner die than sacrifice myself than to live in a world where the violence is going on through a process that I started, the process of independence. So he goes on a fast. And the news starts to spread. That Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi, which the word Mahatma means great soul, the father of the nation, both nations in some ways, Pakistan and India, he has decided to go on a fast. And the violence, the fratricidal violence of a city where people are just butchering each other starts to happen. Now, here's a dramatic representation of that moment. Has anyone seen the movie Gandhi by Richard Attenborough? Kirtan, I'm going to ask you to kindly. Shoma, could you please upload it to Canvas? I'm going to mute myself here. I should have muted myself earlier as well, but no matter. That look, I think captures exactly what Gandhi expects will happen. It's a fantastic scene. It's, the guy who played Gandhi, by the way, you may know him now, Ben Kingsley. Wow. Wow.
I know of him.
I'm sure you've seen movies with him. Anyone seen Iron Man 3? Anyone see Iron Man 3? Really? It was a horrible film, but he was in it as well. Anyway, this moment, this guy, right? To his credit, he does a fantastic job of playing out. Sorry, Julie, I'll come to you in a second. Just watch it again. Right. What's powerful about this moment is that Gandhi understands how fear and hatred reinforce each other. And he psychologizes or psychologically sort of diagnoses that extremely well. And he says, you do not have to be captive to this vicious dynamic of how fear and hatred kind of reinforce each other until you can't find a way out. And you are led through your pain into smashing the head of a child against the wall. This is not abstract stuff. The movie is a portrayal of that scene. But it is a real thing that was happening, and it happens. And Gandhi says, I know how that works. And the way that works is there's nothing dubiously evil about you for having done that, though you may feel that way about yourself. It is the product of a certain understanding of force that you have been trained into creating. The world meets you a certain way, and you react to it in that way. The world greeted you with love, you would react with love. The world greeted you with hate, you met it with hate. And in the process, you basically mirrored whatever the world threw at you. Your freedom did not, as a possibility, did not even arise to you, that you could act differently. But there is a way. And the way is to show you that you don't have to be bound to your own hatred. That you don't have to go a certain path. Your fear need not lead you down this path. Your fear of bodily harm, your fear of some sense of yourself being harmed, these are things that constrain you. Love, on the other hand, and this is something that Martin Luther King talks about as well, love is the antidote because it can actually release you. If you can teach yourself how to love, you can teach yourself to attach to the world in ways that are productive. Learn to love somebody else. Learn to love somebody else not as an image of what you want them to be, in this case, a child that you will raise as a Muslim, but as who they actually are. And that capacity to be surprised by how you were your own jailer, how you were constraining yourself. That surprise, I think the actor in this film sort of conveys powerfully. Like the way his eyes change when he realizes what is just happening. There's something very religious about this. And it's no surprise that both Martin Luther King Jr., who was a pastor, and Gandhi used religious language to convey this. But it is possible, Gandhi thinks anyway, to use force in a different way. The force of love is different than the force of physical weapons. And Gandhi thinks one is superior to the other. Moral transformations are possible and can be the key to more lasting change. And if the constructive program, which I'll say talk about very briefly today, but we'll come back to it on Monday. If the constructive program is anything, it's an attempt to acknowledge two things. One, that the kind of critiques that he makes of modern civilization, while he still holds to them, are somewhat unsustainable in the face of the brute reality that the world is changing, or has changed remarkably between the time when he wrote these texts and by the time when he writes a constructive program. But it's also an attempt to create soul force and love to weave it into the very fabric of a political body. How do you create a society in which love, understood in this way of sort of transforming people, can be one of the mechanisms that is key to that polity? So I think we'll talk more about this, but the thing that Andrew mentioned about khadi, about weaving your own cloth, is an attempt to learn to unlink yourself from hatred, to unlink yourself from the chains that bind you to your trauma. It's kind of like, I don't want to belabor this point too much, but it's important. It's kind of like In psychoanalysis, people talk about this very frequently, right? Like how we repeat our trauma upon other people. And in that process, we gain some control over how our trauma oppresses us. We inflict it on other people. Our parents shout at us, we shout at our children. Or something, some version of that. That trauma comes in different fashions. Gandhi, in this particular context, is interested in the civilizational trauma that the British have inflicted on India. The trauma of telling Indians that they are not worth the dignity that all human beings supposedly have. And so the trauma of being not recognized as full humans by the British leads the Indians to say, well, maybe when I become like you, when I can hurt you the way you hurt me, then you will recognize that I am human. And Gandhi says that trade-off means you've given up your humanity already. That's not where your humanity will be. Getting, the best medical care, getting railways, getting lawyers, getting the best machinery and the machine guns and the cannons, sure, will give you the chance, the opportunity to kill people, but it will not make them recognize you as a person, which is ultimately the trauma that you're trying to get over. How do you live in the world that demands things from you, that ask you to compromise yourself while still remaining a human being? That's what the constructive program in some ways is trying to do.
Do you think he was successful in doing that?
No, he failed. Absolutely. Unmitigated failure. In creating a political system in which love was at the core of how that policy worked. But does that mean, oh well, I don't hang out with losers, okay? Only winners for me. If that's the argument you take away from it, then Gandhi is not your person. But even that hope of imagining what that world would be like, I think Gandhi is inviting us to think about that. And so to the degree that, as Matt said, pointed out, we hold up people like Martin Luther King Jr. and Gandhi and other people as, ideals. There are certain, things that they ask of us after the fact that we have to follow through on. Any questions at this point? We have 5 minutes left.
That was where I was trying to go with that. Like, since he failed, basically, like, where do you go from there? But you kind of answered that. Because it's obviously you keep trying, but I don't know. It's just like other movements did do it.
Do you think that the response in India and Pakistan between the violence, do you think that the response to Gandhi's his fasting, do you think that it was integral for the context that Gandhi had previously led the movement that liberated India from the British? Would it have worked if it was someone else that wasn't nationally renowned?
Probably not in that case. Yeah, probably not.
Immediately when you said that what he did, I was like, okay, because if anybody else had done that, it wouldn't be significant. Because there's been a lot of women's like history in the Middle East, women's rights, where they have done fasts before.
Sure.
That's gotten attention, but in terms of any kind of action after that, no.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. If I was to approach Gandhi, if I was to say, okay, Gandhi, cool. If I was to do the, all the stuff you're saying is pretty interesting, but let's be real. Why were you successful? The reason why Gandhi was successful was because he was the first political actor in his context to bring the masses of poor people into politics. And so he had behind him sort of, a political constituency that he had built himself. And so he was a political actor who had a political philosophy, who was able to do this. And yet, I think Gandhi would tell you, when he was a no-name person, he would still go and walk into a hail of, police batons, because he thought that was important to do. So maybe it would not have worked with anybody else. Maybe. But if its efficacy is not, I think is the wrong question to ask. Or say it's a question to ask, but I think it leads us too far in one direction. The other way of thinking about it is to think about, well, what is he asking us to think about in terms of how states function? Because you can imagine if there are riots happening right now, what do you think is going to happen? What's going to be the state's response to a riot? What was the state's response to a riot?
Tear gas.
Force. Is that a better weapon? It's more effective, maybe. All it did was it just made people cower and run into the, and hide. The Hobbesian method is the one that we use to transform people. We tell them what's the right thing to be afraid of. Racism? Don't be afraid of racism. Be afraid of the state. Which is more effective? If that's the question you want to ask, then the Hobbesians win. But effective at what? I mean, I think it's the context. I can tell you people in India absolutely, some people adore him, some people absolutely hate him. He was assassinated, that's how Gandhi died. He was assassinated by people who hated him, who were Indians, actually. So, makes for fascinating puzzle. But, I don't know. Any other thoughts about this?
Did he actually, I don't know how accurate the scene was, but did he actually present himself as someone who could tell someone that they're not, he said, I know the way out of hell, and the way that you can escape it. Did he actually present himself as someone who could, answer people's, or tell the future, or be able to?
No. I think he was, I mean, I don't know if he actually said those words were actually exchanged in that fashion. It was the context of what the guy said. He's like, I'm going to hell. I've committed a sin. Like, well, if that's what you're afraid of, I have a way out of it. And the way out of it is like, you're trapped by your trauma now. You don't know how to get out of this. You've basically replicated back and forth the trauma, and now you're in this place where you're just an abject creature with no way out. Here's the way out. Love. So I don't think he didn't see himself as a mystic or whatever. People wanted to cast him as that. And maybe as a political actor, he used that sometimes to his advantage. But I don't think he claimed to have any kind of insight, any spiritual insight beyond truth and love.
In my lifetime, we've seen people who are like conscientious objectors and people who sort of undermine the state, like Julian Assange and Edward Snowden are like the primary examples in my life. And people like Lincoln and Martin Luther King, they stood for the radical integrity of their convictions, but they also paid for it with their total deaths. They were both assassinated.
Right.
And when you have this sort of use of violence, like if Julian Assange and Edward Snowden came to America, would they be given a fair trial?
Julian Assange is in America, isn't he? Isn't he?
Edward Snowden's the American, Julian Assange is Danish.
No, but isn't he in America? He's Australian, actually.
I don't know. I know
Because I
that.
think he was kicked out of the Ecuadorian embassy. Let's talk about this on Monday. Let's come back to it. I'll see you guys on Monday.